همیشه ما گورستان‌های نو می‌آفرینیم، اما دل مرا ببین که در گرو گورستان‌های کهنه است که گورهاشان در خاک غربال می‌شوند. زمان کشیده جهان را به توبره و ناگهان کسی از راه می‌رسد هزاره دیگر و بر مزار سنگی و سقفی و نام و نشانی می‌افرازد و در برابر آن دو دست بر سینه به سنگ می‌نگرد، می‌گرید شبیه من.
A little sound from the late Dr. Reza Baraheni, the great Iranian writer who died at the end of last week. To talk about his life and legacy, I'm joined by his son right now, who in fact captured the video that goes with that sound that you just heard on his phone. Arsalan Baraheni is a Canadian producer, director, a writer, and artistic director based in Toronto, Montreal, and Los Angeles. His independent films have premiered in some of the most important cinemas and universities around the world. He's the founder of Baraheni Films and the artistic director of the Montreal Independent Film Festival. And right now, Arsalan joins me from Toronto today. Hello, Arsalan.
Hi, Jian. How are you? Thank you for having me in your show.
I'm first of all, I'm so sorry for your loss, brother. The last few days could not have been easy for you. How are you doing?
Well, it's been very challenging. I mean, like, we didn't expect this heart attack to happen, and this happened about 3 days ago. And you know that my father was suffering from Alzheimer's for the past 6 or 7 years, but it kept escalating, this awful disease. And he broke his hip, and then we couldn't take care of him anymore. He was staying at a nursing home the past couple of years, and then the pandemic came. We couldn't visit him as much as we wanted to, so it was very challenging, very heartbreaking for all of us as a family. And I mean, he's known as a legendary poet. He's known as the father of literary criticism in Iran. So, and he's also perhaps the most important Iranian Canadian figure in exile. As the president of PEN Canada, as a university professor, and as an activist. So it's been very challenging, very heartbreaking for all of us. And I should thank everyone from inside of Iran and outside of Iran who've been sending us all these flowers and messages and everything. And on the other hand, you're dealing with a lot of, extremist groups that are attacking him day and night, trying to disregard what he's done when it comes to the literary language and poetry in Iran, and his contributions to the literary language. So it's a lot going on, my friend. It's a lot going on.
I want to get into some of that. I know that these are difficult days and busy days for you, so I'll try not to keep you too long. But first and foremost, there's a funny thing, isn't it? When somebody has been sick for a while, as your dad had been, and incrementally so. And it was, as you know, it was personally heartbreaking for me, because I would ask you in recent years, do you think he'd be okay to do an interview? And you would just say, he's just not totally able to do that, in terms of his faculties and his abilities. But there's this notion that when somebody has been sick, it's somehow easy or expected or softens the blow when they pass. But that's not really true, is it?
Honestly, his passing was somewhat gradual for me as a son, because I saw him, I saw his disease and how it kept, eating him up, and how it progressed every single day that was passing, So it was kind of gradual. It was kind of a gradual death. But a family member's death is never easy, regardless of your relationship. Even all the relation, in all our relationships as fathers and sons, we have our ups and downs, obviously, But losing a father is never easy, and especially for him, because we were really close. I mean, like, our relationship was not just like a traditional father-son relationship. It was more of a artistic friendship, a very close friendship. There was no, he was always against censorship, and you know that, how much he fought for censorship in Iran,
Yes.
for human rights in Iran, in both regimes. I mean, like, here's a man who was imprisoned in both regimes, in
Yes.
Shah's regime and then the Islamic regime. And here's a man who had to migrate and live in exile twice in both regimes, And a lot of people, unfortunately, extremist groups that are in the media right now, they don't care about the literature, the writing, the poetry, and what he's done when it comes to human rights. And they're very ideological, and they're trying to create their own character from this important literary figure, which is international, and it doesn't belong just to the Iranians, it belongs to the world,
How Arsalan, how aware was he? I would think it'd be crushing, especially for such a brilliant intellectual. How aware was he in recent years that his mind was ebbing?
He was somewhat aware, but he was trying to deny it. He wouldn't accept it, because the people who have Alzheimer's, they don't know they have Alzheimer's. They don't remember, and they don't know that they're forgetting, and then Alzheimer is not just about your memory. You start getting paranoid about everything that is happening around you. So it's like paranoia, hallucinations, memory, and all these things, combined together, and it's very painful for him and the rest of the family members to take care of him. And I honestly, I never talked about his Alzheimer's much, because I didn't want to basically bring this up in the media, but it was very painful for me to take care of him for years, me and my mom, because my older brother lives back home in Iran.
Yes.
My stepsister's in the States, in Washington, and sometimes she helped us out when we needed help. A few times, he went to the States and, he stayed there. But most of the time he was here with us, and we were trying our best to take care of him and do our best. But at some point, when he fell down in the shower and broke his hip, then he went to the hospital, and it was just out of our control. We couldn't do anything afterwards. We couldn't take care of him. He needed to be under supervision of the nurses full time, But they're not aware that they're developing Alzheimer's, and that's what makes it a lot more challenging.
Yeah. I want to get into his life and his legacy and some of the ways that he's been seen, as you say, through an ideological lens, usually unfairly, I think, in recent days. But before we get there, just personally, how would you, for somebody who'd never met him, how would you describe your dad?
I would describe him as one of the most legendary Iranian and Persian poets who basically, that we are also Azerbaijani Turks, but my father is one of the most important Persian poets, and he's also known as the father of literary criticism in Iran. This is something that didn't exist like this, before the publishing of some of his books, which dealt with literary criticism in Iran, such as Talad Ahmes, all the other books that he's written, Kimya Haq, many others, I would describe him as one of the most legendary Iranian poets and a human rights activist. That's how I would describe him.
You profiled him in one of the three films you made in a trilogy called the Exilic trilogy in 2015.
That's true.
What did you want people to see in him in that film?
Well, the film was basically, the film dealt with exile and the exilic mind. I know you spoke to him before about the exilic mind and liminality, perhaps, and some of those things. And I was fascinated with that, because there's a part of his legacy and biography which deals with the exilic mind and what happens to the mind of the artist in exile,
Yes.
And perhaps a lot of people that live in Iran, they don't know about this aspect or this side of his life, So I wanted to bring some of that into this film. And the film is called Alchemy and Dust. So it's basically about how a poet takes the words and he turns it into gold. You know what I mean? So it's an alchemical literary process with poetry. And you know how important the Persian poetry is. Persian poetry is known as one of the most important, influential, and powerful poetries in the world, you know? So the film is a very poetic film, and I'm narrating the film as his son, shooting the film in exile. So the film deals with exile, his life, from my point of view, basically, and it's the colliding of basically the camera and the poetry and the words and the camera and his life together. You know, it's a half an hour episode as part of the Exilic trilogy, which was released in a few cities in the States and in Canada as well, you know.
It's very powerful. I think you may be able to, people may be able to find it online if they search for it, but it's powerful. And you're right. I mean, I had a couple of interviews with him. The one that I always remember was in 2006. We did this. It was about an hour-long interview. It was a national interview. It was live. And he just blew me away. I was a little nervous at first. I was, I didn't know him at that point. I'm speaking to this important Iranian poet and novelist, and we're live, and I want to represent the Iranian,
you have to remember,
he was amazing. The interesting thing is, I mean, he is known as this incredible orator in Persian, but I just want to underline that he was also an incredible orator in English, and his explication of what he was, of the exilic mindset in that interview, is something that has stayed with me for the last 16 years as a really powerful, one of those ways of deconstructing the Iranian mindset. Those of us who live outside of Iran, especially Iranian mindset, that I've not heard anyone else touch in such a profound and personal way, and it was very memorable and interesting, of course, because he was not just doing this as an intellectual, but he was speaking of himself as a writer in exile. Your family was forced to leave Iran in the 90s. You were about 14 because of your dad's stance against censorship. What can you tell us about that time?
Well, you have to remember, my dad's PhD is in English language, and obviously his greatest talent was in linguistic structures, and this was his gift from childhood, because he was born in a poor family in, the Tabriz city in Azerbaijan, obviously.
Of course.
He was born in a very poor family there, but from perhaps from the elementary school, this person was fascinated with language, and this was his greatest gift, and he dedicated his life and legacy to the language, and literally language, and this was not just the Persian language. He defended the other languages, including his own mother tongue, and that's why some of the people are very ideological, because the nationalists don't like the fact that he defended the other minorities in Iran and their languages, sometimes. But the truth of the matter is, my dad, during the Shah's regime, my dad was imprisoned. And I wasn't born during the Shah's regime. I was born after the revolution myself, So he moved out of Iran. He was fighting against the Shah's regime. And all our intellectuals, they thought they were going to have some sort of, human rights and freedom of speech when the Shah is gone. You know the rest of the story and what happened after the revolution, obviously. A lot of people are trying to judge our intellectual movement and what happened in our history based on the Iranian Revolution and that timeline where they were fighting against Shah's regime. And they're trying to condemn all our intellectuals because they were speaking against Shah's regime because of the Savak and because of the tortures and because of the human rights elements, But what happened afterwards, that my dad was very hopeful that the revolution was going to change the country, just like the rest of the intellectuals.
Sure.
He returned to Iran with my mom and my older brother from the States. He was he was also teaching in the States. He was teaching in various universities in the States, And he returned to Iran, but what happened was devastating for him and for the rest of the family. He was fired from university. He was imprisoned again. And then when he was active in the Writers Association of Iran, they wrote the most important letter when it comes to censorship and freedom of speech in Iran, the 134 writers' letters. And they sent it to Arthur Miller and, the International Pen, and
Yes.
everyone supported that letter, and it became huge in the world. It was like perhaps one of the most important movements that came out of Iran and the Writers Association. But then there were threats, and then there were the chain murders of Iran. And some of his friends, such as Mohammad Mukhtari, were killed during the chain murders.
Yes.
This was the main reason for why we had to settle in Canada and apply for refugee
Asylum.
status in Canada.
Yes.
Yeah.
Were you how aware? Were you fearful as a kid when you were in Iran? Were you aware that
I knew what was happening because they were watching our house full time, and then they were taking him for questionings, and then the other writers like Saidi Sirjani and many others were like arrested. They were imprisoned, and there were lots of things happening. Like, they came to him and said, "We'll cut you up if you don't stop talking," And this is what they did to his friend. That's why we had to stay here and settle here. And he stayed as an exiled writer for all the rest of his life. Till his death, he stayed in exile.
Arsalan, do you know why he was? Did he ever talk to you about why he was so committed to free speech, to fighting censorship? He was a great writer, a poet, a fiction writer. He didn't need to be as much of an activist as he was one of the founders of the Writers Association of Iran in the late 60s, all the way up to working with PEN Canada, etc. Why was that so important to him?
Well, Jian, you have to remember, most of our intellectuals in Iran, throughout the history of Iran, they have struggled with the authorities when it came to freedom of speech and censorship. All they demanded and all that they wanted was to be able to write freely. When it came to their characters, when it came to their novels, when it came to their political or social views, we have the right as a human being to write freely and express our opinions freely. You know what I mean? And a lot of people right now in the West are even fighting for freedom of speech.
Sure.
And for obviously in a patriarchal, masculine, traditional culture and civilization such as the Middle East, it's been a lot more worse. And even right now, we have many people who are fighting against censorship, but they're following in his footsteps. You know what I mean? Like some of his students, some of the people in the Writers Association in Iran, we have the same things happening all over, or even the filmmakers in Iran, or all the artists, all that the Iranian intellectuals wanted was to be able to write freely. But because of this, all of them were somewhat politicized and got involved with political or social issues, and a lot of times they didn't even want to become political characters. They just cared about their own arts. And I believe this is what might have happened to my dad too, because what he cared about was his artistic character, literature, writing, poetry. But when somebody comes and tells you, you can't write this, you have to get rid of this sentence, you have to get rid of this character, then obviously you're going to go and say, I don't accept this censorship. I'm tired of it.
How hard was it? How hard was it for him to not be able to return to Iran or visit Iran in the last 25 years? It was very hard.
It was very hard. It's been very hard for all of us. Even for me, I came here when I was 14. Sometimes I wish I could, all of us, maybe even you in your subconscious, we would have loved to have a country where we could have lived and worked freely.
Oh, not my subconscious. I mean? I'd go there tomorrow if I could. I mean,
same thing. I wish I had the ability to make a film in Iran without censorship, without being worried about any sort of authority. You know what I mean? But it was very difficult for him, especially in the last few years after, because, at some point he was the president of PEN Canada. Obviously, he was very active, in the Iranian community, the Iranian Canadian community, the Canadian community with Massey College, York University. So he was busy with all these things. But then when he stopped working, he became very lonely. At some point, he came to me and said, "You're my best friend because nobody comes to visit me."
Oh.
You know, and that was very heartbreaking. I remember one day I hugged him, and then he was like crying and saying, like, "I think you're my best friend now." You know, so it's been very challenging for all of us.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough.
And I understand the anger that even some of the extremist groups and the younger generation of people have, because I believe that millions of Iranians outside the country are angry too, because they want to have a country, they want to have a homeland, they want to belong to somewhere, they respect their language, their culture, their tradition to some extent. Even if they don't, they want to see some revision. They want to see a better future for the country where they could live together. And I hope to see some sort of unity at some point amongst Iranians, instead of seeing them fight with each other continuously, day and night, you know?
Well, I have to say, I mean, that that clip we played, that passage we played, that clip from your father, it really is somewhat prophetic. He's talking about how we project all kinds of ideas and opinions and identity onto a tomb when someone has died, and that's happening to his legacy already, as you've intimated throughout this interview. Can you talk about how you've been affected by how your dad has been talked about in the last few days?
Well, first of all, poetry and art itself is somewhat prophetic. You know what I mean? You always project yourself. You always bring something from inside of yourself, from your subconscious, from your past, and then you're projecting your future to some extent too, you know? That's an element of art, and it has nothing to, I can't say it's mystical, but it might sound somewhat mystical, you know, even though he wasn't into mysticism. But some of his poems are actually, they're very musical, they're very prophetic at some point. Like, I sometimes post some of his poets on social media, and it seems like he's talking about himself, about his future. And the same thing has happened in his novels sometimes, you know? So that's absolutely right, what you just said about it being kind of prophetic, you know?
And how are you affected by what you've talked about, that the different groups sort of taking kind of using his name in one way or another?
I believe in dialogue, and that is what he believes in. This is what I learned from my father too, and I believe that our intellectual movement itself demands not just freedom of speech or like human rights or the elimination of censorship. It's about being able to have dialogue. You know what I mean? Somebody might say that he doesn't believe in God, and somebody else might say that he believes in God. This doesn't mean that you should be enemies. Somebody else could be a leftist and have their own way of thinking, you know? To have dialogue is progress, and it's more democratic to have dialogue, I guess. But unfortunately, our community is missing this. Everybody has become very ideological. Everybody sees the world as black and white. So this is very painful, you know? So you can't really have dialogue with somebody who's already made his mind with absolute terms and definitions, you know?
I really appreciate you taking the time today. I know what it's like to lose a dad who you really love and respect as much as I did my dad and you did yours, and it is not an easy thing, and I know this is a difficult time for you, and I appreciate the time you've taken to talk about him a little bit with us. You know, you said something interesting when we began. You said your relationship with Dr. Baraheni was not that of a father-son, but was of two artists. Or can you speak about that a little bit?
It was a very close relationship. I know a lot of his secrets. I know a lot of his biography. He revealed things to me because I think maybe subconsciously he thought that at some point maybe I'll be able to reveal some of these things. You know what I mean? And he trusted me with those things. He was very open. He was a very open-minded character. The elimination of censorship from like in Iran was not just in those terms, but it applied to our family too. So we had a family that was very open with each other, and in all terms and in all relationships. So we were very close. We used to laugh a lot, talk a lot at nights. We used to walk around the house, talk about history, about arts, about literature, about filmmaking. And I think filmmaking contributed to this, because when I started studying films, obviously I talked more to him about my own work, about my own scripts, because I wanted to know what he thinks about my own writing or my film projects. And then I noticed that he was about to basically lose his memory at some point. So I started to record a portion of his life, and turn it into a film, In Alchemy and Dust, and my other film, A Poet is Killed, which deals with censorship and human rights and the chain murders in Iran. Yes. He's also one of the main characters in that film. And the rest of all the material that we see from my father in BBC Persia, Iran International, and Voice America, all of them actually come from my studio, And I'm glad I did this, because it was right on time. And if I missed it by a few months or a few years, it would have been impossible for me to have those footages, And a part of it goes back to our personal relationship and how he trusted me and how close we were together, not just as a father and son, because we didn't have a typical father-son relationship, as I mentioned to you. It wasn't like a traditional father-son relationship,
Was he hard on you artistically? Would he look at your work and be critical, or would you?
No, in fact, I don't mention this a lot, but I always know that he was the first person who encouraged me from childhood when it came to arts. And he encouraged a lot of other younger generations as well. And right now in Iran, I see a lot of his fans are the younger generation who never met him, but they connected to his work, to his poetry, or to his writings,
Did you ever feel pressure? Did you ever lament the fact that I think I remember once after a screening of your film, you told me that it sucks that people always want to talk to you about your dad,
I felt pressured, and I still do feel pressured by the fact that everybody wants to give a single identity ideologically to our family. I might have my own differences from my own father when it comes to my own historical, political, social, or artistic views. His views might be different to me, So you can't just a lot of people want to say, you have the same views, you have the same character. So if somebody hates my dad right now, they hate me. And if they love him, they love me. That doesn't make sense to me. You know what I mean? But this is what happens, obviously, in traditional, somewhat patriarchal cultures. And in patriarchal cultures, they always have more respect for the elder people too, So your dad always comes first. That's why I ran away from the Iranian community. I'm trying to always work outside the Iranian community. But then this Iranian identity is always with me, regardless of where I go, because it's a part of me, I can't get rid of it. So that's why, even though I live outside of Iran, even though I kind of grew up outside of Iran, a lot of my films still deal with the Iranian, basically with the Iranians and the Persian language and the Iranian culture and the Iranian system.
How could you quit it?
Particularly the intellectual movement in Iran.
You can't quit it. It's not going to be possible.
You can't quit it.
What? Last question to you. What will you miss the most about your dad?
I miss talking to him. I miss talking to him, walking around and talking with each other, walking around. And sometimes we used to get in fights too, because obviously not physical fights, but then we'd have arguments, I would talk about something in history, or he'd say, no, I think it's like this. And I'd say, no, it's like this. And then we'd get into these huge arguments, but I miss those arguments. I miss those moments, late at night. Imagine the whole world is sleeping, and then you're walking around talking to your dad, and you're talking about some of the most important artistic or social or political or cultural things in society, or the history of mankind. And then you get into a fight, and 2 hours later you're still talking to each other because we never disconnected. So it wasn't like we missed talking to each other for a day. No, we talked to each other all the time, even if we had an argument. And I've never had this relationship with anybody, you know.
Arsalan Jan, I'm so sorry for you and your family. My condolences. I'm so sad that to not have your dad around. واقعا تسلیت میگم, and I really thank you for taking the time and
it was my pleasure to speak to you, Jian, and thank you for your kind words. I appreciate it.
Take care of yourself, brother.
You take care too, buddy.
Khuda
Thank
Hafiz.
you. Bye-bye.
Arsalan Baraheni, an Iranian-Canadian writer, producer, and director, and the son of the late Dr. Reza Baraheni. Arsalan joined us from Toronto today.
همسفر با من بیا تا بشنوی ایران من کجاست وطنم در قلب من در شعر تو در استخوان ماست و به رقص برخواهد خواست آزاد و پر لبخند مثل دماوند. همسفر با من بیا تا بشنوی ایران من کجاست وطنم در شعر تو در رقص من بر آسمان ماست و چه زود برخواهد خواست آزاد و پر لبخند مثل دماوند.